Greetings, my friends. Greetings and salutations, and welcome to the Sunday sermon yet again. I'm your host, Reverend Riff. Thanks for being here. I do appreciate it, and I hope everybody is having a great day today. It's Super Bowl Sunday. Some of you care, some of you don't. That's okay. I will be participating in a lettuce wrap throwdown. That sounds really bad for Super Bowl Sunday, but yeah, that's what we're going to do. We're going to make some various fillings, have some lettuce, and some fellowship as we watch a football game that I don't really fucking care about. Mainly because my team's not playing, but that's just sour grapes. Need a little more mic volume? I can do that. How's that, Bale? Did that help? And yeah, that shirt, the big fucking Space Dragon party shirt, is here. Oh, yeah. I mean, if I used to make fun of Christians for wearing, crosses on everything. And how's that? I can even give you that much. Does that bring my dulcet tones more to your ear holes? Because that's what we're trying to do here. But yeah, I used to make fun of Christians for always having, their crosses and shit on. And then I found a big fucking Space Dragon shirt. And I'm like, do I just order 5 of these? It's better now, though? Okay. Yeah. I like it off to the side because when it's in front, I stare at it. But yeah, off to the side. I tried to angle it a little bit, but if you can hear me, we're good. All right. So thanks for being here. And yeah, so last week we got introduced to the New Testament and all of the nonsense therein. And we talked about how a lot of those books are, pseudographic. They are written allegedly by Paul or Peter or John or James. But we don't actually know who wrote most of those books, other than we know that it probably wasn't the dude whose name is on it. And that's okay. We understand that this happened a lot in history, that you took somebody's name and put it on a document because it followed their philosophy, but you realized it would gain more traction by putting their name on it than your own. That doesn't make it any less dishonest. Don't get me wrong. But it was not unique to the Christian faith, and I feel like I need to acknowledge that. I don't want to be accused of not being fair on that point. So, that said, yeah, we know Paul didn't write most of those books. And what I think is interesting, and we're going to talk about today some, but I just want to get into it right now. Let's dive the fuck in. Is that Paul has multiple voices. And when someone is talking about Paul, you really, to have a fair conversation, to have a truthful conversation, I'm tough but fair. That's me. I'm tough but fair. To have a true conversation with them, you need to identify which Paulian voice they're talking about. There is Paul in his own words, which is the Gospels that he wrote. There is Paul in the book of Acts, which is somebody else 20 some years after he died, telling you his story and maybe embellishing it, or shall we say tailoring it to fit a narrative of a certain other famous person, making it parallel. Or are they talking about Paul from the later letters in the book that we talked about last week? Paul is the best Beatle. Welcome, Hux. Good morning, my friend.
It's a big dog and it's taking a fat dump.
And there's the Paul of the later letters that he didn't write. And that Paul is not the same Paul that was Paul in his own words, or the Paul from Acts. They all have a Paulian mentality, but it's not the same voice. And I feel like we need to really get into that because that's key to unraveling what we started, the seed that I sowed last week. That all of this was a Roman counterinsurgency operation. That Christianity is a psyop that was also part of a propaganda mission to legitimize Roman rule and to try and tamp out the constant flare ups of Judaism. Kurt Cummings with the subscription. Thank you. Raise hell, praise Dale. But yeah, it's, and so we sowed those seeds last week that this was all part of a Roman idea to get everybody on the same page. Because what had continued to happen is, see, the Romans, let's take a second. The Romans were fairly, the picture that is painted by the Christians of the Romans as these harsh assholes that, came in and crushed everybody's religion and, made you worship all these guys. Not true. The Romans were actually super tolerant of other religions. They didn't care. They found that coming in and stripping somebody's religion out just led to constant revivals of that religion and uprisings. It didn't work. Instead, if you just let people have that, but also added in yours, shit worked out really well for them. And so they did this quite effectively. But then they met the Jews. And you see, the Jews were one of the only monotheistic peoples who, it's right there in their charter, thou shalt have no other gods before me. So it kind of was a no deal that the Jews would work with the Romans on this. And so Rome consistently had these flare-ups because the Jewish people, their religion is absolutely, it's core to their identity. Unlike some other religions or some other peoples who their religion was important to them, but it wasn't, it didn't define who they were like it does for the Jews. And so the Romans could infiltrate them, could mix their religion with theirs and just kind of make it work. And of course the Romans, even their religion is basically Greek religion 2.0. Like, they loved the Greek gods, they loved the Greek religion, so they just kind of hijacked it. This is what the Romans do. They hijack a religion and ingratiate themselves into it till it becomes synonymous with their own, and therefore assimilate the people into Roman culture. Got it? That's what they had been doing really well since the Punic Wars. The Punic Wars ended, and Rome had officially established itself as the baller, group of people in the old world. They expanded their empire, but those pesky Jews, their hang-ups about monotheism made them impossible to deal with. That is really what this comes down to, is there was just always an underlying Jewish group that would be like, nope, one God, the Romans are not part of this, we have to be ourselves, we cannot work with them. And so the Romans figured out a way to break that down. Because what had become super popular, the most popular prophecy in all of Judaism was the star prophecy. There would be a star in the sky. And when that star appeared in the sky, a Messiah would be born. And that Messiah would be the Christ. He would lead them out of subjugation and destroy the temple, create a new temple, a new world, and lead them into this 1,000-year period of bliss. And that was it. That was the Jewish thing. The Romans said, what if we told them that guy already came? And what if we told them that actually this whole new temple and everything is metaphoric? It's in the heavens, it's in the skies. No. Eat shit in this world so that you can eat well in the next. That was the nonsense that the Romans peddled. And it was such a hit in Judea that they started peddling it in every city. Because what's the best way to unite an empire? Unite them under a religion. You want to get people to do shit that is against their own personal well-being, you got to get them to believe in a cause. And while nationalism works great, And the pride of being a Roman citizen was certainly something that united people. You know what unites people even more? Their fear of death and what comes after. And if you can convince them that if they do all this stuff for you that is not necessarily great for them here on this mortal plane, giving you 10% of their money, obeying these strict rules, running off and dying in a crusade, all of those things are against your own self-interest. How do you convince people to disregard their own self-interest? You convince them that they're part of something bigger, a religion. And Rome perfected this. They test marketed it in Judea, and then they rolled it out nationwide, and it was a bigger hit than the fucking iPad. Everybody was in, and we ended up with a one church state. And it was about as successful as you can be for well over 1,000 years. So if you want to look at it from that way, the Romans delivered on their promise. Like the Hulkamaniacs, that's the only way to take on the church. It's the Hulkster. Maybe he was a new Messiah. Because you see, that's the thing. Jews never, that's the misconception that so many Christians have. There's never one Messiah. Jews believe there can be multiple Messiahs at the same time. Christianity was like, nope, they're waiting for that one. Nah, they were waiting for the one to kick the Romans out, but then there probably would have been another one that they were waiting for to do something else. What the Romans did is hijacked this so well that it became the most dominant religion on the planet for many, many years. So let's dive in, and today we're going to talk about Paul. You will notice that I will not refer to him as the Apostle Paul. There's a simple reason for that. He's as much of an apostle as Dr. Dre is a medical professional. Okay? Paul declared himself an apostle. Nobody called him the Apostle Paul. He was never given that title. That was retconning by the church leaders years later. That was by people who believed in Paul. They wanted to add weight to his name, and he became the Apostle Paul. Because Paul was never a fucking apostle. He never was. See, there were the apostles and disciples. It's an interchangeable word. There were 12. That was very specific. 12 tribes of Israel. You've been here. I'm assuming you've all been here. You get where this is. Okay. Well, we all know the story of Judas, which we're going to get very specific into we're going to get very specific into why Judas was Judas. Let's just put that, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. But we all know Judas betrays him, right? Judas betrays Christ. Christ is crucified. Well, now there's only 11 disciples because Judas hangs himself in the field. So, they got to pick a new one, right? They held a group, and Peter, Cephas, the Rock, he's the leader of this group, and he says, all right, we got to pick a new guy. Judas did nothing wrong. Amen. And so he's like, we got to pick a new guy. He goes, we got some ground rules. It has to be somebody that knew Jesus, like had actually met him. Cephas laying the rock bottom down. Yeah, he said it had to be somebody that knew Jesus, like personally, like was there. So Paul disqualified right off the bat. And he said it has to be somebody that's on the same page as us. And this person also has to be able to write, because we need the new guy to definitely be good at writing down everything that happened, because we totally need to document this awesome shit we're about to do. They ended up with two candidates, Barnabas, who actually was buddies with Paul, and Matthias. They had a vote. They cast lots because they wanted to inject gambling into it, so to speak. The Rock claimed it was because they wanted God to truly pick the person. Do with that what you will. But Matthias wins. So Matthias is in. And Matthias was regarded, he was somebody that had been kind of on the outer rim of Jesus' inner circle, if you will. He had been there. Apparently he had seen a lot of the stuff Jesus had done. He knew the guy. There are some scholars that believe that Matthias is who actually wrote some of the documents that eventually became the book of Mark, and that the name Matthias is who they're referencing when they say Matthew, not a different Matthew that was an apostle, but they're talking about Matthias, the guy who came in as the second 12th disciple, so to speak, to fill the void. I just wanted to give you that backstory to let you know that Paul was never an apostle. Paul was never in the club. Paul instead gate crashed the party and said, "Hey, fuck your religion. These are my rules to it. Yo, your God totally appeared to me. And no, I never met him. No, I didn't know anything about him until yesterday, but he told me you guys are doing it wrong. You got to do it like this." And the main thing is that you totally have to like deal with the Romans. They're cool. Jesus said so. And by the way, everybody's the same, Jews and Gentiles alike, and no, you don't have to do penal mutilation to be in the Jewish party. Got it? Now, what I just explained is exactly what Paul said in crass vernacular. Does that sound like a religion to you, or does that sound like a way to dismantle a different resistance movement that is based on a religious prophecy? Yeah, that's what I thought. So let's dive in to this week's sermon. That's a nice religion you got there. Be a shame if someone stole it. Because that's what Paul did. That is what we are going to look at plain as day. Paul hijacked the Jewish faith in the ultimate act of anti-Semitism. He said, your religion doesn't exist anymore. Your God told me. You should totally just hang out with us. It's fucked up. So let's dive in. I want to set the scene for you. We're going to do a little Jewish history here. Oh, Riff, we didn't think this was a history show. Well, fuck you. It's a history show now. So buckle up, Buttercup. 167 BCE to 160, Judas Maccabeus, he leads a revolt. Notice, what's his fucking name there, kids? His name's Judas. He's a revolutionary. We should probably paint that dude as a bad guy. Judas Maccabeus leads a revolt, and his... Right, I think I'm back now. Sorry, guys. You hear me? Are we back now? I can't tell if we're back now or not. It was, yeah, I don't know what the fuck that was. My stream was there and then it wasn't. It was very strange. I don't know, but I appear to be back. I think I'm living on the edge here. All right. So, yeah, Judas Maccabeus, he leads a revolt. He eventually dies at the end of the revolt, but it's all good because he inspires his people. Now, we're talking about, at this point, Alexander the Great has been dead for, 150 years roundabout, and about 170. And, his empire had fractured. We've got... It was probably Paul. Your Hey Jude joke. It was just too good. Twitch wasn't ready for it. But yeah, so we've got the Ptolemies down in Egypt, and the Seleucids over in Syria. And they're constantly fighting for control of Jerusalem. In the early part, right after Alexander's death, the Ptolemies are in charge, and the Ptolemies are very tolerant of the Jews. They get along pretty swimmingly. As their influence recedes and the Seleucids take control, they're much more antagonistic of the Jews. They start squeezing every penny out of the Judean area that they can, and also start imposing religious restrictions until eventually they defile the temple in 167. They put tax collectors inside the temple as well as their own gods. And put that hard P, the Ptolemies. And so when that happens, they shit hits the fan. Judas Maccabeus leads a revolt. I'm gonna let you guys in on a little secret. Judas Maccabeus and his camp totally told everybody that he was the Messiah to lead them, to freedom. They were also a very specific group of people. They were, as we have read about numerous times, they were Sadducees. They were the priestly line. And the Maccabees they were the high priests who said, we got to clean the temple out. They killed everybody that was, they killed all these fucking, Seleucids, pushed them out, basically fought them to a standstill until the Seleucids realized that they were losing way too many guys dealing with the Jews, and so they basically just backed off. It was never an official like victory, but more like they just left. They were like, you know what, this isn't worth it. Kind of like U.S. policy towards Afghanistan. They just left. So that happens around 160. Oh, my clicker isn't working. So then the Hasmonean kings, those basically are the descendants of the Maccabees. They rule kind of a semi autonomous place from around 140 to 116. They are not kings, mind you, as much as they are the high priests who dictate how things go in daily life. Somewhere in this time period, the Seleucids start referring to whoever the high priest is as the king. And it basically becomes an implied kingship to where not instead of just being the line of priests, they become a line of kings. And the historians have fought for many years about how much of that was intentional on the Maccabees' part that they wanted to be kings, and how much of that was the Seleucids just recognizing that whoever was ruling the area in their eyes was a king, whether you call him a priest or whatnot. So just keep that in mind. Around 116, the Seleucids, like King of the Ring, exactly. Austin 316, that happened. So the Hasmonean kings, around 116, the Seleucids completely fall to shit. They are done. They've been trying to deal with the Romans, so they have completely ignored Judea. And the Jewish empire, under these Hasmonean kings, grows to about the biggest you will ever get. It is all through what we think of as Jordan today, parts of what today would be Syria, even pushing up against Egypt now. They're controlling all that until 63 BCE. And a little guy named Pompey heads down there and curb stomps them. He sacks Jerusalem. It's not good. He slows their roll. He handles his business. And so after that, Judea is under the control of the Romans. They leave the Hasmonean kings on the throne, but they are basically puppet kings at this point. They're vassals. You know what I mean? Like, again, at this point the Roman Empire is still growing, it's still getting its feet wet into the whole ruling the world thing. So they largely leave them alone as long as they can squeeze some tax dollars out of them and, still exert the control they want. This goes on until about 37 BCE. And this is where shit gets real spicy. In 37, there's a difference of opinion. We've talked about them a lot on this show, Pharisees and Sadducees. Well, the Pharisees, being a different, ideology than the Sadducees, they're sick of the Sadducees running everything. Because remember, the Sadducees are they're the Maccabees. They're the aristocrats, the old world, and they are running the show. The Pharisees, at this point, have a more popular mandate and are trying to increase their own influence. They've decided. Now, the Sadducees at this point are very different than the Sadducees that we hear about later on. And I think we need to address this. Much like at the turn of the 20th century, the term Republican and Democrat kind of switched what they mean. And one went from being the, stanchions of the poor and for federal oversight, and the other one became racist assholes. And they kind of flipped around the 20th century, 21st century rather. They kind of flipped really hard in that time frame. Well, the same thing happened with the Sadducees and the Maccabees. Those words kind of they mean different things depending on what time in history you're talking about. So, I'm going to use those terms, but I will try and explain what they mean when I use them because they're malleable. Depending on what time frame you're talking about, the Sadducees especially have very different opinions on cooperation with foreign powers. Let's put it that way, okay? So, keep that in mind. So, the Pharisees, they had decided, you know what? I'm sick of these fucking guys that are still running the priests. Because remember, even though the Romans are in control, they're still allowing the Maccabees, who are the Sadducees, to operate as kings. They're ruling, and the Pharisees have decided, you know what? I'll bet you if we collaborated with the Romans, we could get those assholes out of here. And that's exactly what happened. They hooked up with the Romans and were like, hey, we can deliver you popular support for a new ruler, but you have to get rid of these assholes. By the way, they're totally anti Roman. And so the Romans go, yeah, you know what? This sounds like a great idea. I'm fucking in. And so the Romans go get a guy named Herod. Herod is not a Jew in any way, shape, or form. Herod is an Edomite who also has Syrian, he's basically an Arab. And they go, nah, this guy's our king. And the Pharisees back him. And they storm Jerusalem. And in 37 BCE, the Pharisees engineer a plot. They have a coup. Herod, with Roman soldiers at his back, marches in. They slaughter the Maccabees. Just about everybody who's a Maccabee gets killed. He does his damnedest to cut off the bloodline. Kills children, everybody. When they talk about Herod slaughtering the children in the Bible, in Matthew, this is what they're referencing. Herod didn't slaughter a bunch of kids in Bethlehem to try to kill Jesus. Herod slaughtered a bunch of kids to cut off the Maccabean bloodline in 37 BCE. Are you seeing where they cribbed stories to make their propaganda work better? I hope so. I hope you're seeing it. So Herod gets installed on the throne, and he wastes no time in snuffing out anybody that could try to claim to be from the old bloodline. The Pharisees, who are the collaborators with Rome, become now the dominant voice in Judaism. Herod, he takes the throne with that Roman backing, and he rules till 4 BCE. He is an asshole. He never gets his comeuppance. You want to talk about an awful historical person who lives to a ripe old age and dies having achieved everything he wanted. Just like genuinely a giant piece of shit. We're talking about Herod. Herod sucks. Slaughtered, killed his own kids when he thought they were getting too popular, because literally anyone but him was popular. He was a big asshole. He instituted large-scale building projects, some of which are still visible today, although historians have pointed out that he basically did it by enslaving his own people and forcing workmen to work without being paid, and then they starve to death. Well, then you don't owe them any money. It was a great system. He was a dick. He dies, and everybody was really excited about it, in 4 BC. His kingdom is divided among his sons and his sister. His one son, Archelaus, is given Judea, but the Romans decide they don't like how he's doing things, mainly because the Jewish people don't really dig him because they were never fans of Herod. And so they send him to Gaul, and the Romans decide we're just going to have to rule Judea with, governors and keep troops there because these people are starting to get testy. Notice this is around the time Jesus is claimed to have been born. We're starting to see the seeds of revolution grow. 6 to 27, despite some discomfort, things are relatively peaceful. And the Jews are allowed religious exemptions by the Romans to practice their faith, and for the most part, it keeps things. Let's just say the pot is not boiling yet, but it's starting to bubble. Around 27, Greek culture really starts to seep in to the day to day Jewish life. At this point, as many Jews are speaking Koine Greek as are speaking Aramaic. The Roman laws, the Romans are starting to decide that they need, to expect a little more of the Jews. And then obviously the religious practice of the Jews. Those three things have really kind of come to loggerheads at this point. And Caligula shows up around 37 CE, and he really takes his little boots and steps in it. As he begins to go completely batshit insane, he decides that he is truly a god and that he's not going to tolerate the Jews not recognizing him as such anymore. He wants a giant statue of himself put up inside the Jewish temple. Now, while this never happens, cooler heads prevail. The governors in place at the time go, do you just want to start a war? Because that would be easier. Because, this is how you start a war. They decide that they'll just not do what he says. So they don't. But the rumors of him wanting to do it get out, and the people are pissed. Right around the time he gets executed, the Jews see a vacuum in power. And just a few years later, the Jacob and Simon uprising occurs. We don't know a lot about this uprising other than there were a pair of brothers, surprisingly named Jacob and Simon, who decide to lead a revolt against the Romans. It doesn't work. They get captured, they get executed. But again, the seeds have been sown. This, now, if you're looking at those dates and remembering last week, this is right around the time that Paul decides to become a prolific letter writer. Now, if you remember, just a few years earlier, Paul had had his conversion. Yet Paul didn't do a lot in the early years after his conversion. For the first couple years, he just kind of hung out. And then magically, right around the time this uprising happened, Paul went on tour telling everybody that you totally didn't need to be a Jew anymore. Very coincidental. In 64, Cassius Florus takes over the region, and he decides that the treasury and the temple are his personal piggy bank. He also decides he doesn't give a shit about these religious exemptions the Jews have been given, that damn it, he's in charge, and he's going to show everybody that he's in charge. This does not go well. What is key that also happens around this time, we're not sure when exactly, is that James, the brother of Jesus, is murdered by Jews who are they're controlling the temple, and James is doing things different than them. James is saying that he doesn't recognize their authority over the temple. So he gets thrown off the top of the temple and then beaten to death with clubs when the fall doesn't kill him. Sucks to be him. But yeah, that's how that happens. Well, riots break out all over the city, and a full-scale war breaks out. The Jews actually do pretty well early on in the battles. They fight in kind of an atypical kind of guerrilla warfare, if you will, and it actually does okay at first, until Vespasian comes up with a fucking great tactic. Like, this is military amazingness here. Vespasian figures out that he can just attack. He basically just kind of stops skirmishing and just goes in and starts razing any town that harbors the fugitives, the zealots, as they are known. They all fall back to Jerusalem. So they basically all get this idea that they're going to make a big, massive last stand at Jerusalem. And had they fought united, the Romans had considered that taking Jerusalem might not be worth. He wouldn't have fallen to his death if there had been a parapet. Fuckers. Why do people not follow the building laws? And so the Jews, they massed their strength in Jerusalem. But Vespasian knows something. Vespasian knows that these Jews all hate each other. And that the only thing that they have in common is that they don't like the Romans, but yet that's not exactly their uniting characteristic. And sure enough, as soon as they all make all the fucking revolutionaries are in Jerusalem together, they start fighting over who's in charge. They start slaughtering each other inside the walls while the Romans sit outside and wait. Vespasian realizes that he's got this under control. You remember, we're in 69 now, where the year of the four emperors, the first three idiots have all been making a mess of things. Vespasian goes, dude, I got the Judea thing under control. I'm taking over. He heads back to Rome. He leaves his son Titus to mop shit up in Judea, which Titus does. Titus waits until the Jews have basically reduced their forces. And then, in a truly bonerific move, the Zealots burn all of the food stores inside of Jerusalem. Why? Because they decide that they want to force a final confrontation. These are fanatics who would rather die in battle than submit to Roman rule. So instead of letting this siege play out and eventually a peace would have been negotiated, they burn all the food stores inside their own city to force their comrades to fight. They fight. It ends very poorly for them. And Titus sacks the temple and kills everybody. He then decides that the Pharisees decide to, they got to rework this because they were collaborators in this and a whole lot of people died. So they rework it that Titus and his father Vespasian were the messiahs. Look at the time frame. It works out. The book of Daniel talks about a 70-year period. Well, if you go that Jesus was born in 0 and 70 is when the temple fell, Daniel's prophecy makes sense. But it wasn't Jesus, it was Vespasian and Titus. They're the messiahs that liberated the Jews. They liberated the Jews from their religious overlords and ushered in a time where everyone could do as they please and believe as they chose. That is the timeline and what actually happened. And again, when you look at the creation of the Gospels, which we all know were written right around, the first one, Mark, was written around 70, 73. Well, look at that time frame. It lines right up, doesn't it? That Vespasian and Titus claiming to be the Messiah happens right around this time. And that's why in there's the prophecies by Jesus where Jesus says, some of you will see me come back in your lifetime. Because Jesus dies in 30, 33 CE, somewhere around there. And then in 70, he comes back as Vespasian and Titus, just like he said the temple is destroyed and a new day has begun. And again, not to belabor the point, but the Romans did rule for over 1,000 years, so technically they got the prophecy right. Just saying. So let's have a sex party. Because I feel like we need to take a little, we need to understand that there's more than two sects. We've got the Pharisees. They're Roman collaborators. They believed that the entire Old Testament was worthy of study, and they found ways to apply it to daily Jewish life. These guys also, they read the prophets. They believed in oral law as well as what was written down in the Torah, and that it should influence every bit of your life. They were not so big on the temple, mainly because they weren't in charge at the temple, so naturally they poo-pooed on it. In the Bible, they are presented as being the group of the people There's some historical reasons to believe that is a colorful retelling on the behalf of the Romans, because if these are the guys that collaborated with you, absolutely you would want to tell people, nah, everybody loved these dudes. That's not necessarily the case. And we've got the Sadducees. They're the old guard. They considered that the Torah, the first 5 books in the Bible, are the only parts that are worthy of study. They embraced temple rituals and that the priests were the supreme rulers, that Israel didn't need kings, it had high priests. And mainly that happened because their bloodline was in the Sadducees, so naturally they supported that rule. It's amazing how people, believe what is beneficial to them. They rejected an afterlife. They did not believe in the raising of the dead. The raising of the dead is a phrase that is used a lot in the Bible. It doesn't necessarily mean actual bodies flying out of caskets and like coming back to life as much as it means a rebirth, an afterlife. They weren't into that. They were representative of the pre-Herodian times. There had been a few of them that had survived the purge. They're still around. They were the elite. They still, despite Herod's attempt to snuff them out, there were still a few of them that had maintained some pretty wealthy families. And there weren't a lot of them. We know this from Josephus. Then there was the Essenes. These guys, they're more like hermits. They reject all aspects of public life. They embraced poverty and celibacy, except for when they realized that if they never had kids, it would be really tough to keep this movement going because, people are into sex. So they decided that sex should only really happen for procreation. If you look at a lot of what the Essenes believed, it mirrors what Paul believed a lot. Paul's weirdo hang-ups about sex and his, constant references to just different things. Paul very possibly could have been an Essene, not a Pharisee like the Bible claims. Paul's got a lot of similarities with these people. But yeah, they lived separate from everybody else. They would live in little enclaves. They didn't completely go out into the desert, but in every city they would kind of have their own little sect of people, and they would interact with everybody else as little as possible. Their acolyte program took over 3 years. And you always, when you were in that time, you had to eat by yourself. Your evening meal, their evening meal was a communal meal that they ate together in silence. Because I don't know what sounds more fun than getting together with all of your friends and not talking during dinner. Sounds great. They were against things like oaths because they believed that if you swore an oath, you might circumvent God's plan because you're saying that you would do something and maybe God wouldn't want you to do that in the future, but now you've committed yourself to doing it. But that said, when they took an oath, it was a lifetime thing, and they were super serious about that. These people were committed. And then you get the Zealots. They tended to be Pharisaic in their beliefs, except for they really, 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 really hated the Romans. These were the guys that believed with the Pharisees religiously, but could not get down with collaborating with the Romans. They splintered away around 6 CE. Again, right around the time that they claimed Jesus was born. And they weren't popular with anybody who was not a radical. If you weren't advocating open, hostile warfare against the Romans, you weren't popular with these guys. And they were more than happy. As I said, they burned their own people's food stores during the siege of Jerusalem to force a confrontation because they were sick of waiting around to get the fighting going. These guys were nuts. Many Jews actually considered them non-religious because they would not fall in line with the religious authorities at the time. They were considered non-religious. Meanwhile, it's that they were so religious, they felt that any collaboration with the Romans was against their religion, and they directly rejected it. They also rejected the Hellenization of the Jews that was going on in earnest. They hated all of it. And so now you kind of understand who the players are. Josephus tried to erase the Zealots from his histories. And again, I think it's important to know too, Josephus is our number one historical guy for all of this. He's the one who wrote down. Do you know what his name was? Josephus, let's take a minute and talk about this. Josephus was a Pharisee who was a military commander, not because he was any good at being a military commander, just because the religious group ruled, so he became a military commander. He was supposed to defend the Galilee area. Where have we heard of Galilee before, friends? Where have we heard of Galilee? Oh, that's right. It's where Jesus did his ministry. Well, he did not do a good job of defending it. He got his fucking ass kicked. He got stomped. But a funny little thing happened. And when the Romans captured him, instead of killing him, he started foretelling that the Romans were going to actually take over and that was a part of Jewish prophecy. And the Romans go, we kind of fucking like this guy. Let's adopt him. The guy who adopted him was Vespasian, founder of the Flavian dynasty. And Josephus's name became Flavius Josephus. And so everything that we have written historically on this happened to be written by a turncoat traitor who sided up with the Romans and was adopted by the guy who became emperor. So keep that in mind, that every bit of historical document we have, it's super, super biased. It's pro-Roman as fuck for a reason. So, as I alluded to at the beginning of the sermon, Paul has multiple voices. Who is this Paul guy that is going to take this idea now that Vespasian and his son Titus, that they are the Jewish Messiah, and that they have come and liberated the Jews from their slavery to their religion, that they are ushering in a new dawn of the Jews having their own religion that's the same as everybody else's. So it's not really theirs, but that's okay, and it's totally not erasing your identity. That's the stuff that Josephus was selling, and Paul really has to go out and do it. And the way that Paul does it is decides that Judaism is not exclusive to Jews anymore. We're changing the rules. Everybody can get involved. And that will water down Judaism to the point that you won't have these rebellions and resistances because it'll just become passe. So there's Paul the letter writer, the guy that we think was actually Paul. He wrote about Jesus like he had never even been a man. He never relays tales of Jesus' life. Everything he talks about with Jesus is this ephemeral, spiritual being, this ghostly superpower. And his main thing was that Gentiles and Jews can have the same religion, and that it did not involve Mosaic law at all. That was Paul's, the actual Paul, that was his message. Then you have the Paul of Acts. He is far more confrontational towards the Jews and anyone else who opposes what he's saying. Now, keep in mind, this was written during the mid 80s, where at this point, Domitian is on the throne. That is Titus's younger brother, and he is actually persecuting Jews, not Christians. He's persecuting Christians because they're Jews. He's persecuting anybody that is not accepting him as the deity, because the guy had penis envy, for lack of a better way of putting it. His brother and his father had been regarded as these Jewish messiahs, and after they took over Jerusalem, they tended to rule without a lot of problems. People were okay with them. It's pronounced tit-us. But when he took over, because his brother Titus, who was well-liked, died young, he decided that he was going to reinstitute the idea of the Roman emperor is a true living god and everybody better fall in line. And when obviously the Christians and Jews couldn't get on board with that, he started persecuting them. This is the persecution that is ascribed to Nero when during Paul's time. Nero wasn't persecuting people for religious beliefs. Nero was persecuting political opponents who were revolutionaries. 20 some years later, Christians were being persecuted for religious beliefs, but it wasn't Nero. And I feel like that's really important because Christians constantly miss the boat on that. Also, yeah, in Paul's Acts, he is very clear that being a Roman citizen is the most awesome thing ever. If you read the book of Acts, we're going to do that this season. We're going to do a whole thing about the book of Acts. It is an endorsement of how awesome it is to be a Roman citizen, far more than it's a story about anything religious. It is really, it's, hey, Jews got you down. Good thing you're a Roman citizen. They can't fuck with you. That's the entire book of Acts summarized. That is my Cliff Notes for Acts. Then you get the Paul that is the later letter Paul. This would have been the Paul of around the 90s, closer to 100 CE. Domitian is dead, and the persecution has died down. Instead, the church is starting to flourish, actually. And so, what is that Paul concerned with? These are our Who Paul letters, as we talked about last week. That Paul talks all about church hierarchy, conflicts within the church, and makes sure that everybody knows that the church is the boss. Again, this is very clearly Roman influenced. They're using it now to solidify their position. And the gap in the letters of Paul, the gap from Acts to these later letter Pauls, perfectly mirrors the time that Domitian was the emperor of Rome and his persecution. Like that gap, like he wasn't on board with this little operation. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were written and hidden by people that we believe today were probably Essenes, they refer to James the Just and Paul the Liar. And that is what we're going to talk about here for a little bit. That Paul, everybody knew he was full of shit. He was clearly a Roman collaborator who was attempting to create a peaceful relationship between Jews and Gentiles by erasing the Jewish faith. He's a fucking dick. One of the first things that we have to question, how was Paul a Roman citizen? Because the book of Acts really hammers it home that Paul was a Roman citizen and it saved his ass numerous times. But I have questions. Paul is purported to be a Pharisee of Pharisees, as well as a Roman citizen. That it really doesn't add up. Because while the Pharisees were Roman collaborators, they very rarely actually leaned in and became Roman citizens. Mainly because that would involve doing some things that religiously they just weren't into. And also, the Romans, they tended to keep your enemies close, but only so close. The Romans were like, no, we like Jews, but we don't like religious Jews. Because your religion tends to cause us problems. So the idea that Paul was a Pharisee and a Roman citizen, to anybody who understands the political era of the time, right there, it's a red flag. It's, again, and Paul even admits in his letters that he's a chameleon. That he says flat out, I'm a Jew when I need to be a Jew, and I'm a Gentile when I need to be a Gentile. And so, maybe Paul was a Pharisee and a Roman citizen. Maybe he wasn't actually a Pharisee at all, and was just claiming that because he needed some authority to tell Jews that their religion wasn't real anymore. Where'd you go to school again? See, Paul, in the book of Acts, and then which is not written by Paul. Again, keeping in mind that is the voice of Luke. Luke states that Paul studied at the feet of Gamaliel. Gamaliel was one of the most famous high priests of all time. He was a leader of the Pharisaic movement, and he was fairly in line with the Jews. He was one of the first Jewish leaders to really lean into the, hey, war is not the answer. We can maybe get along with these guys. So Paul would have definitely shared ideological similarities to this guy. But there's a problem. Gamaliel taught during the time of Jesus in Jerusalem. If Paul had been a student of Gamaliel, he would have been in Jerusalem at the same time that Jesus was doing his thing. Paul would have been there for the crucifixion and all that. Yet Paul himself repeatedly states that he never met Jesus, that he doesn't know the guy, that he never heard of the guy until after he died. So how could Paul have been in Jerusalem studying under the most famous Jewish teacher of the time and been completely unaware of this guy that was causing the hubbub that Jesus was in the area? It's really simple. Paul did not study under Gamaliel. He said that because, again, he's linking ideologies. He's saying, hey, all you Jews, you like Gamaliel. And Gamaliel was kind of controversial for saying that we should collaborate with the Romans. Well, I studied under him, and he's right. Jesus said it too. Again, he's trying to shop credentials here. He's a Roman citizen. He's a Pharisee. He studied under Gamaliel, but none of it really adds up if you actually think about it. And when you confront Christian apologists with this, they say they're how do you know Paul studied under Gamaliel? He said he did. That is there, despite any any lack of evidence, all the circumstantial evidence that actually says that he probably didn't. Christians just say, well, Paul said so, so we're just going to take him at his word. You talk funny. Paul wrote all of his letters in Koine Greek, and not well. Paul's letters do not come across, the actual ones that are written by Paul do not come across as the letters of an intellectual, educated man. They come along as somebody with basic education, not a true scribe or real letter writer. Acts also claims, in the book of Acts, they claim that he spoke Hebrew to a crowd, which would be really suspect, because Hebrew was not the language of the common people. Aramaic was. Aramaic and Koine Greek were what the average person spoke back then. Hebrew is what the Torah was written in. So if he was speaking to a crowd in Hebrew, most of them would not have been able to understand what he was talking about. Also, when we look at a lot of Paul's writing, it doesn't really check out that a guy with a religious pedigree wrote this. Let me explain. Now, let's look at the citizenship. You could be a Jew and a citizen of Rome. You absolutely could. I'm not saying you couldn't. But it's not really explained here that if he was truly a Pharisee, if he truly believed what Pharisees believed, he would not have been able to make the religious concessions necessary to be a Roman citizen. Conversely, being a Roman citizen would put him at odds with a lot of what the Pharisees were teaching. And no one ever addresses this. I have looked and looked for someone to make sense of it, and the genuine Christian consensus on this is Paul said so. No, it doesn't really make sense that he was a Pharisee and a Roman citizen, but Paul said so. Again, if his father had been a Roman citizen, that would have made him a Roman citizen too by birth. But he also claims that his father was a Pharisee. He says he is a Pharisee of Pharisees. So, again, it doesn't make sense that you'd be from this line of devout religious people, but you're also Roman citizens. Not just collaborating with Rome, but you've actually become a citizen. In all likelihood, He had become one of the Sadducees that had begun working against the Pharisees with the Romans, or he was just a regular Jew who was also a Roman citizen. And that seems really likely that he was a Hellenized Jew that became a Roman citizen through his family's connections and decided that he was going to take it upon himself to break down these walls between the Hellenized Jews and the religious Jews and the Romans. That he was going to erase those walls by telling Jews that Judaism didn't need to exist anymore. His education, again, Luke claims in the book of Acts that Paul studied in Jerusalem at the feet of Gamaliel. Paul never actually says that. Paul mentions his studies once. Paul states that he was a learned Jew, advanced far in his studies. But Paul doesn't name drop, and Paul loves to name drop. Paul name drops every chance he gets. If Paul knows somebody, Paul tells you. But yet Paul never mentions Gamaliel himself. It's Luke in the book of Acts that mentions that Paul studied under Gamaliel. Again, seems more like retconning, trying to give credence to what Paul said, to make Paul's message have more weight to it. But yeah, Paul, again, said never heard of this Jesus guy. And then we talk about the language. His complete reliance on Greek is really strange. And what I mean by that is there's the Septuagint. It is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Anytime Paul quotes the Old Testament, the way he quotes it makes it obvious that he is referencing that translation, not the original Hebrew. It seems strange because if Paul is a Pharisee of Pharisees, he would have been intimately acquainted with the Hebrew translations. Yet he never references them. He always, when he gives his little bits of the Bible, it's very clear that he is referencing the Greek translation. And it's also very strange that he refers to it at all, because Paul repeatedly states that his goal was to convert Gentiles to this Christ religion. Gentiles would have had no reason to read the Septuagint. No reason at all. Why would they have read that? It's the Old Testament. It's a Jewish book. Why would you quote that unless what you're actually trying to do is bring Jews over in and you're trying to take their religion and make it for everybody. It doesn't make sense because, again, I just don't see why would you quote that these Greeks, surely, your average Greek surely wouldn't have read that, wouldn't have any idea what you're quoting. So, liar, liar, Rome is on fire. So Paul had been doing his thing. Let's talk a little bit. Again, let's get back to our timeline here. Paul had been doing his thing around 48 CE. Paul starts doing his thing. And if we're to believe the book of Acts, Jews are furious that Paul is pissing on their religion, telling them that you don't need to observe it anymore, and that it's not just for Jews, and you don't need to do any of the stuff to convert that Jews had traditionally required. Because Jews had always accepted converts, but converting was very specific. You had to keep kosher, you had to abstain from sexual immorality, as stated by the Jewish custom, and you had to get circumcised. And most Gentiles had a real issue with that third one. Paul decides that doesn't matter anymore. Let's get rid of that hang up, and then we can all have the same religion. That's Paul's gimmick. The one thing that was stopping Gentiles and Jews from sharing the same religion is that Jews were insistent on keeping kosher and mutilating their genitals. And the Gentiles just couldn't get on board with that. So Paul goes, wait a minute, God called. He said you don't have to do the parts you don't like anymore. I mean, it's so fucking obvious when you break it down to its basis thing. Christianity is the easy level of Judaism. It's Judaism on the very easy setting. That's all it is. According to Acts and Romans, Paul was sent to Nero. Okay? Nero Nero decided Paul had riled up the Jews so much, traveling all over Rome, or all over the Roman Empire, telling Jews they didn't need to be Jews anymore, and telling Gentiles that they could get in on the same religion that the Jews had, but now you don't have to cut your dick. And they were all like, fuck yeah. Paul claims he was very successful. He may have actually been. And the problem was that the Jews who weren't digging Paul's message were supposedly getting real pissed. They were beating Paul up. He got stoned all the time, not the fun kind. And that the only thing that saves him repeatedly is that he's a Roman citizen and the Romans come in and bail Paul out. Which, why would they fucking care unless this was their guy spreading a very popular message for them? Well, eventually, the Jews demand that Paul be put on trial. And just like Jesus, the Roman guy who's presiding over the trial says, I find no fault in this man. And the Jews say, the ultimate blood libel, the same thing that the Jews said about Jesus, which has been used by people to exterminate Jews ad nauseum. May his blood be on us and on our children forever. No, the Jews did not say that. That's fucking insane. No one would say that. But the Romans want to make it very clear that Paul is just like Jesus and that the Jews want him dead. So Paul appeals to Nero. Paul says, I'm a Roman citizen. I will answer to Caesar and no one else. And the Romans say, okay, you appeal to Caesar you must go. So Paul is sent to Rome to talk to Nero. And a magical shipwreck happens, but Paul doesn't die. Fun story, Josephus, on his way to Rome, had a shipwreck. That mirrors Paul's shipwreck story exactly. Exactly. Just saying. And so Paul gets to Rome, and we never hear from Paul again. That's it. That's the story. You never hear from Paul again when he goes to Rome. So, historically, we're told that Paul was beheaded by Nero because he was a Christian. There is zero fucking evidence of that. For all we know, Paul retired having achieved his goal. For all we know, Nero did cut Paul's head off because his psyop turned bad. Why? Well, around 63, 64 is when they claim Paul was sent to Nero. The Great Fire of Rome just so happened to break out in 64. And, yeah, not a great time for anybody. Are you kidding me? Okay, I thought we lost the stream again. But, yeah, the Great Fire of Rome breaks out, and Nero blames it on Christians. There's a lot of evidence to believe that what it was Messianic Jews who were mad at this psyop that was being run that was, pissing all over their religion. And that's what they were mad about. And that's why they lit Rome on fire. Whatever the case, we never hear from Paul again, except for letters that start popping up 20-some years later that definitely weren't written by him. So maybe Paul lived, maybe Paul didn't. What we definitely know is that he ceases to write anything after this time until many years later, and the voice is completely different. Sounds to me like a psyop that got the plug pulled on it. Then Nero dies, and we have the Year of the Four Emperors, and Vespasian comes in and goes, hey, I remember that Paul thing that Paul angle we were running. Let's try and revise that. Let's run it again. Because that was working really good up until now. And there's nothing fishy about this at all. That the timeline of Paul seems to coincide so perfectly with this unrest. And that, Paul appears right when he needs to, and he goes away when he's becoming an issue, when he's becoming a liability, and then when it's convenient for him to come back, he comes back again and writes more letters, even though he's long gone. Now, I don't know that the later Paul letters were the work necessarily of the Romans. I think at that point, people who had adopted Paul's philosophy used his name to, because if you look at those later letters, they don't really further a Roman agenda anymore. Those later letters are way more about setting up the church in a very Roman fashion, mind you. You can find infinite parallels between the organization of the church and how the Romans organized things. It seems more at that point that the Romans are like, hey, this church thing is working. You guys do your thing. And the Jews who were running the churches and the Gentiles who were running the churches consolidated their power by saying, yep, let's write more shit and put Paul's name on it because Paul was the best. And that's what Christianity is, folks. It's a fucking psyop to destroy Judaism. That's all it is. That's all it ever was. We're going to beat that horse into the ground this season. I'm going to keep hitting you with facts on it. But yeah, that's Paul. That's Paul, guys. He was just a tool in the arsenal of propaganda. It's very telling that his name originally was Saul because there's a story that there was a priest named Saul who was a Pharisee, and that he is who opened the gates to allow the Romans in to install Herod on the throne in 37 BCE. And it just so happens that this other guy named Saul opens the gates to Judaism to everybody and erases all the parts that they don't like that make it hard so that everybody can get on the same page again. Just like the original Saul claimed that he opened the gates to allow the Romans to install Herod because it was the only way to ensure peace in the land. I'm just saying, there's a whole, where there's smoke, there's fire. And there's more smoke here than in Matt Pike's bedroom. Okay? That's all I'm saying. Thank you so much for being here again this week. And next week we will continue with this. Actually, no. Next week we will very likely not be doing a sermon. I apologize. I will be on vacation. We will be back the week after. If by some crazy reason I feel like doing a stream while I'm on vacation, maybe we'll just pop in and do a real impromptu Ask Riff Anything religious sermon. That might be fun. But we'll play that by ear. But thank you everybody for being here. I appreciate you. And let's all be more like anyone who wasn't Paul. Because Paul was a dick who ruined a perfectly good religion and instead created this lumbering behemoth that has molested children and ruined the world. Because at the end of the day, Christianity failed even Paul's very simple message. Paul set Christianity to easy mode. Paul's version of Christianity is believe in Jesus and don't be a pervert. And as the Catholic Church has shown us, that is an impossible task. You cannot believe in Jesus and not be a pervert, apparently, because there's just way too many perverts that believe in Jesus. So, they couldn't, Paul made it as easy as possible, and they couldn't even get that right. So, I'm going to say, don't believe in Paul,